Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We are currently in Module 7. In this lesson, we're covering another mini project, this one on ASP.NET Core MVC. So let's look at the homework, which is to build a Core MVC application with 2 pages. Create a page that takes in a person's information and another that takes in the address information. So just like before, first name and the last name is active on one page, and then the other one, the street address, city, state, and zip code. No need to associate the 2 pages together because, again, with web pages, that would be something you do through a database. You wouldn't do that by sending the information from one page to the other directly. Probably a good idea here, though, to create a new controller for these 2 pages. Maybe something along the line of the person controller, maybe a controller for each, a person controller and an address controller. That sounds about right because with a person, you can list all the people. You can have your create for a person. You can have your edit and your delete for a person. And the same thing would be true for the addresses. So that might make sense to do 2 controllers. It's up to you, though, how you structure it. Maybe play around, try it different ways, and see what works best or what you think you like the best. Okay? Once you have completed that or given it your best effort, and please, again, practice is super important to learning C#. Just watching me do it isn't going to be enough. So definitely practice this. Once you're done, and so pause the video now. Once you're done, come on back and unpause this video, and we'll move on with building this application. Okay, so I've assumed that you have completed this homework. Let's go ahead and do it together. I think you'll find it's not that hard because of the scaffolding. So an ASP.NET Core web application, we're going to call this the MVC mini project and the MVC mini project app. And we will select web application model view controller. We're not going to add authentication, although we could. And we are going to enable HTTPS and no Docker support. Make sure it's .NET Core and .NET Core 3.0. Hit create. And now we have our scaffolded out project. Once we're inside here, let's create our controllers. And I am going to create a controller for the person. And I'll create another one for address. Let's create a person controller. So let's start with an empty controller. Let's do a read-write action. I just find it simpler the first time. And we'll create a person. Because the actions we have will be the same for both of them. It's just kind of easier to set it all up this way. So once the scaffold's out, then I'll create a blank address controller and just copy and paste what I need into the address controller. This right now we're storing a whole bunch of projects and generating the code. Once that's done, we get this. So we have our index, we have our details. We're going to skip a step. I'm thinking we don't need to have a details page. And I'm thinking that we could either do a create page or do it right in the index, but I think it's cleaner to do it on the create page. So let's do a create page, but we're not going to have an edit page. We're not going to have a delete page. Just an index page and a create page with the post start with our person controller, and we want to create a create view, but first we need a model. So let's create our two models in the front end. And we'll do it in the front end so we can put some validation on it. So this is going to be the person model. And the person model has a string first name, a string last name, and a Boolean for is active. Now, I don't always remember, in fact, I rarely remember what the using statement is for the annotations. It's something about data annotations or something close, but I do remember the required, like so. So I control dot, and it's system.componentModel.data annotations. And now I have the ability to have data annotations here. So I can say these two are required, but also let's have a display the name equals first name for this one. And we'll have the same thing for this, only it's last name, again with a space here. And we'll have one more for is active, and we'll call this active user. How about that? We won't put required on top of the Boolean because the Boolean could be true or it could be false, and by default it's false. Therefore, there is no, it's already filled in essentially. So there's no way of saying it's required because it's already done. We could put some length requirements on the first name and last name, but I don't think that makes much sense, especially since some people might go by their first initial. And so therefore, a length requirement would have to probably be 1, if not, then maybe 2, because also first and last names can be 2 letters. So trying to put a length requirement on that doesn't really make sense. The only thing we could do possibly is have a max length requirement where probably names aren't going to be massive, but just to prevent people from putting more information in than they should, maybe you cap it at 50 or 100 characters. We're not going to worry about that for this. There's the person model, and let's create the address model. And the address model will be very similar. So we'll have our 4 fields, the street address, the city, the state, and the zip code. And again, I can just do required instead of having to remember that system.componentModel.data annotation. And for this, I'm going to put a display name or display. I always say display name because I see the two next to each other. Display to the name property to be street address, and that should be good. For the city, we'll have that be required too, and we don't have to modify that in any other way. So let's do the same thing for state and zip code, but zip code does have a display name. Let's copy that and delete this out and say this is going to be zip code, like so. And I also am going to put some string requirements on this. So string length, and that's going to be the maximum length is 10. Because if you have, and this is again US based, so it may be different for your region of the world, but with the US, and that's what we're expecting here is US addresses. With the US, we have the concept of a zip code, which is 5 numbers. And we also have the concept of a zip plus 4, which is 5 numbers, a dash, and then 4 more numbers. So 5 plus 1 plus 4 is a total of 10. So the max length but that used to be a problem. So if it is a problem still, that's how you solve it. Okay, so we're going to leave all the defaults alone and hit add. And there's our create page, and we're not going to do anything to it. We're just going to leave it alone and see what it looks like. And we'll also put our breakpoint on the try to see what happens when we post this data. Let's go to the address controller, right click on create, add view. This is going to be a create page. It's going to be for the address model. Leave all the other things alone and let it do its thing. Once it's done, close it out and put a breakpoint on the try. Hit run, and let's see this in action. Oh, we missed one thing. Let's go over to our shared layout, and let's add two new things here, two new entries on our navigation bar. So I'll paste both of them in. The first one is on the person controller, and it is the create action. And we're going to say create person. And we'll have this one say create address, and that's on the address controller, and it is the create action. All right. So let's run this and see if we can't get our application to work. Let's click create a person, and I'm going to say just create, and it's going to allow me to do it, looks like. It's waiting for it. Yep. It has paused here on my try. We have a collection, and this collection looks like it has 4 keys in it. First name, last name is active, and the verification or validation token. But if we look at collection for first name and do a toString on it, we should see an empty string. So there's no values in that. So it's not reading the validation here. We needed to do a check on that. Let's step through here. It says redirect to action. So it is successfully creating a record. So we don't want that. We want to have a little bit of validation logic in place. So let's look at our person page first and just see what's going on here that we should look at. We have the validation summary here. So we are checking to make sure that, this is the validation message for the overall box. That's there. We have the validation messages for each item, but it doesn't look like we're actually calling the validation logic. And I think the issue here has to do with the fact that we're not actually running scripts. So let's do this. And this is, again, if you're starting off just from scratch, trying it out, what you can do is right-click and delete that CS.html file inside of the views and create it again. So this is just a theory, so if I add the view this time, notice it says when I select create and for the person model, it has reference script libraries. And if I check that box, let's see what difference it creates on the page. And right down here we have render partial async for validation scripts partial. That's the one thing I was missing. And I'm betting. So if I copy that and I paste it over here in my addresses as well to add that validation logic in, that's where the validation gets run on the client side. That's the JavaScript validation, actually. If we run it this time and go to create person and I hit create, it goes, no. You got to have a first name and a last name field. Also notice that first name has a nice little space in between, same with last name, and this says active user, not is active. But that brings up an interesting issue, and that is that while that worked, and just adding that fixes the problem. Let's get rid of this. This is the create page for addresses. So let's get rid of this again. And I'm going to close out all documents but this. So now if we look at the to just the same view. So it's false, just redirect. I am going to do this, and this is something I haven't shown off yet, but we're going to log something. Now, the home controller has logging built in, but we don't have logging anywhere else. I'm going to copy this and bring it over here and just change this to address controller control dot to add the using statement, and we're good to go after you paste in address controller here. So this creates a constructor called address controller, and it's going to ask for an iLogger of type address controller, which essentially just uses this name address controller for the logging, and it's going to get a logger. We're going to store that logger in a private read-only logger variable, and now down here I can say underscore logger dot warning, log warning, and the warning is the user submitted an invalid address upon create. That sounds about right. Just something simple. Just want to show off the logging capabilities. Now I'll put a breakpoint up here. Remember that I took off the client-side validation for this page, and we're going to hit create. Now remember that a zip code has to be between 5 and 10, and all these are required. I hit create, and it says model state dot is valid, and it's saying the model is valid. And that's because I'm not actually asking for that model back. I'm asking for an iForm collection, and that's just not right. So instead, let's ask for the specific model we want. Address model. Control dot to add the using statement. And we could call it collection, but let's just call it, let's call it data. Sounds better. I don't think we use collection anywhere here, so that's fine. Let's try this instead. So now we're asking for a strongly typed model, and we're validating that model to make sure it is, in fact, a valid model. And now we see that is valid is false. So if we go, I'll show you here. Model state is valid is false. So it's saying, nope, that's not a valid address model, because if we look at data down here, city, state, street address, zip code, they're all null. So I'm going to log that message. Now, where does that log go? If we continue, first of all, now my error messages are showing up even though I'm not doing client-side validation, because server-side validation, when it redrew this page, says, nope, you got to fill this incorrectly. But if you come over here to my output window, we're going to see a warning. It's going to go away real quick, but a warning right here that says the user submitted an invalid address upon create. So it's in my output window. But it's kind of hard to see that. Let's make that a little easier. If instead of using IIS Express, if I use MVC Mini Project, and run it and get that that console, which backs my application. I can see all the stuff that's going on. If I come over here and let's just put the console up here like so, and I'll put this down here and say create address. Notice it changed. But then I come here and say create, and let's just let it run, take the breakpoint off and hit go. And now let's look here. We see right up here, warn. And it's in the MVC mini project.controllers.address controller. That's the place where this was logged. And it says the user submitted an invalid address upon create. This is a great way to help debug your application because you can see right away when there is warnings, not just information. Warnings kind of pop off the page a little bit. And then later, if you wanted to, you can log these to a database or to a text file or something else where you log just the warnings and the errors and the critical logs so that you can kind of keep an eye on how your application is doing and how many times you have some of these problems that pop up. Now, in this case, is it a warning that the user submitted invalid form? Maybe not. Maybe you don't log it that way. Maybe you just log it as information. It's up to you and how you want to do it. But I want to show you how it just kind of pops off the page a little bit because we used a warning. An error would be even more bold. It's actually red, and critical highlights it in red. So with that, now we can fill out this, and if we give it 123 State Street, and it's still red, notice that because this used server-side validation, and so it can't refresh these and turn them off from being red until you post back to the server again. So Scranton, PA, I can make that shorter too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I hit create, and that worked. Now let's turn on our client-side validation again. So if we go to the create for the person page and come down here and grab this section and copy it, we can go to the create for the address page and paste it in. There's our client-side validation, which is essentially it just runs this partial, which is this right here, which just has two scripts. And the two scripts are jQuery.validate and jQuery.validate.unobtrusive. So it's a little bit of JavaScript that runs on the client side. So now if we run this, let's put our breakpoint back in our address controller, but this time we're going to put it right down here in the success. So if we hit the try, the model state is valid. We haven't returned. Let's run this again, and this time we'll fill in the entire form and see what the results are, just to make sure that in fact we are posting these values. Now if I stop right there and hit create, nope, can't do that. I have to have a certain length. So I'm going to say, just do the zip code, not zip +4, and hit create. And now if we look at our locals window for the data, we can see 123 Oak Avenue, Scranton, PA 11255. All right, so that now is how we accomplish the homework. It was actually pretty simple using the scaffolding. We didn't have to even type out the HTML. Now, if we look at the HTML, it looks pretty much like the HTML that I wrote for the Razor pages. And I also prefer to have the client-side validation on as well to have that nice feel. And of course, then also apply some of these validators, the decorators, to validate and change how the display looks and all the rest. So that's my personal preference and one that's pretty common out there. And this is why we have UI models. And that's one question that comes up a lot, or one misconception that comes up, is that MVC is a 3-layered application. You may have heard of 3-layer applications where you have your UI, your business logic, and your data access. And so people say, well, MVC is 3 layers. It's got 3 different parts: the model, the view, and the controller. That's it for the homework for this mini project. Let's look at our pro tip for today, which is that you aren't stuck with the choice that you make between Razor Pages and MVC. You can add the other on later. So if you decide, you know what, I think that Razor Pages seems simpler, and that's my personal preference and personal thought, so you're going to start with Razor Pages. But then down the road, you find an area where you say, you know what, it'd be really nice if I could have that MVC structure for this piece. Cool. Add in that MVC structure. You don't have to be stuck with just one choice or the other. Down the road, 6 months, a year, 2 years, it's fine to add in the other structure. Even 2 days, doesn't really matter. So if you decide that this is the way to go, and tomorrow you decide I was wrong, that change is not difficult to make. Okay? Thanks for watching. Once you kind of wrapped your mind around this, move on to the next lesson.